Got your nose on her. Subscribe and I'll think about giving it back. This case takes place in the UK in the 1980s. A few days before Christmas 1984, golfers in Buckinghamshire stumbled upon something sinister on the outskirts of a golf course. In the gloom of December, hidden amongst the overgrown hedges, lay the body of a woman. When the police arrived at the isolated scene, they found no identification and no clothing, just evidence of extreme violence. As officers secured the site, they were optimistic about the investigation ahead. They believed that they would find the killer swiftly, but they had no idea that they were at the start of a case that would span decades. Stay locked in for one of the most remarkable true crime stories in British history. Deirdre Sainsbury was born into privilege in the mid-1950s. Her father was a respected psychiatrist who held a prominent position in his professional field. Yet Deirdre consciously rejected the comforts and advantages that her upbringing provided. She sought neither public attention nor social status. Instead, she chose to embrace a life that would be defined by principle. By her late 20s, Deirdre had become deeply entrenched in Britain's women's peace movement. She passionately despised nuclear weapons and committed herself fully to activism against their deployment. She was known among her fellow activists for her gentleness. Like many young people at the time, she frequently hitchhiked. Her friends often joked that Deirdre could always be found standing by the roadside, optimistically waiting for a lift. In late December 1984, Deirdre set out from London, heading towards Oxford, where she planned to spend Christmas holiday with her family. Standing beside the busy road, she confidently raised her thumb and waited for a passing driver to stop. A vehicle soon pulled over to offer her a lift. Trusting as always, Deirdre climbed into the car, expecting nothing more than a routine journey home. Tragically, this would be the last journey she ever made. Deirdre never arrived in Oxford. Meet Colin Frederick Campbell. Colin was born on the 16th of September 1947 in India during the final days of the British colonial rule. However, by the time he reached adulthood, Colin was living in London. All that is known about Colin is that he worked as a travelling salesman and he enjoyed playing hockey. And it's after one of his hockey games that he ran into Deirdre. As he was driving, he just so happened to notice a hitchhiker and pulled over. This was Deirdre. Deirdre needed a ride, so she climbed into the car, relieved, and likely unaware of any danger. Campbell introduced himself as they chatted as strangers do. Once he learned of her intended destination, he steered his dark Ford vehicle northwest towards Oxford. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The two were just another driver and passenger sharing a ride on a winter night. But as they left the city lights behind, Colin veered off the main route. Deirdre was confused. Colin offered little reassurance, as he said he just wanted to go to a quiet location so they could talk and cuddle. He turned down a quiet country lane near Middlesex. In the secluded darkness of the back roads, Deirdre's fear likely grew. Colin then pulled over and made unwanted advances towards her. Deirdre resisted by forcibly pushing him away and striking him across the face in self-defense. Enraged by this rejection, Colin's temper snapped. In a flash of violence, he retaliated by punching her with all of his strength. The blow landed on her neck and throat, causing a catastrophic injury. Deirdre began to choke and gurgle as her windpipe filled with blood. Colin now found himself alone on a deserted lane with a gravely injured woman, a woman who he had injured, and one that could identify him. According to Colin, panic and adrenaline took hold. Instead of seeking medical aid, Colin chose a path of terror instead. He decided to silence Deirdre permanently. What unfolded next was a scene of pure horror, pieced together later from Colin's own chilling admissions. With Deirdre injured and gasping for air, Colin did not drive to the hospital, nor did he seek any help. Instead, he secured her in the front passenger seat with a seatbelt, trying to contain her and the situation. He then sped off into the night, leaving the quiet lane and driving aimlessly through West London's outskirts. Deirdre then began to drift in and out of consciousness. At some point during this frantic drive, Deirdre came to as her body fought for life despite the trauma to her throat. She coughed and gurgled on her own blood as she breathed irregularly. Colin later described himself as feeling frightened and not thinking clearly as he heard her labour over her pain. Supposedly overwhelmed by the fear that she might survive and report him to the police, he made a monstrous decision. He reached over and wrapped his hands around Deirdre's neck, attempting to strangle her. In his own words, he said, "It seemed like an eternity." He squeezed and released multiple times, not even sure how many attempts he made to end her life. Deirdre fought back, struggling for survival despite her grievous injuries. In the chaos, he stopped the car again. She managed to resist and even tried to fend him off once more, but he struck her repeatedly to subdue her. But strangulation and punches were not going to put Deirdre down, so he resorted to something else: his hockey stick, the same stick that he had used earlier that day in sport. As she struggled to leave the car and escape, he swung the hockey stick at her viciously. The stick crashed into her throat with such force that it further crushed her larynx and cervical spine. Deirdre's fate was sealed. Whether from strangulation or the combined trauma of the attack, her body finally went limp. But even after Deirdre fell silent, Colin was not done yet. Gripped by what he would later describe as a blind panic, he sought to disguise his responsibility. In a grotesque attempt to mislead investigators, he proceeded to mutilate Deirdre's body with a knife, inflicting horrific post-mortem injuries. The purpose, he later admitted, was to make it appear as though an unknown maniac had carried out the attack. He removed every article of her clothing, and then proceeded to stab her an insane amount of times, targeting her chest and genitals. It's believed that he stabbed her private area around 60 times. Rather than leave the clothing with her body, Colin kept these incriminating items, stuffing them into his car, perhaps as a trophy. Under the cover of darkness, Colin then drove onward with Deirdre's corpse in the back seat of his car. Sometime during the night, he arrived at a golf club in Buckinghamshire, a remote area around 20 miles away from where he had abducted her. He then dragged her body into a waterlogged ditch at the end of the course and callously dumped her among the winter foliage. In the lonely ditch, the vibrant peace campaigner's life came to an end at the hands of a killer who had methodically attempted to erase any trace of his involvement. Colin then fled the scene, abandoning Deirdre's mutilated body to be found by whoever happened upon it next. What had started as a chance meeting on the side of a road had spiralled into one of the most violent crimes West London had ever seen. The investigation into Deirdre's murder began almost immediately after her body was found on the morning of the 23rd of December 1984. A groundskeeper at the golf course reportedly spotted what he thought to be a discarded mannequin in a waterlogged ditch. Only upon closer inspection did he realise, to his horror, that this was a woman's corpse. The police soon arrived on the scene. They identified Deirdre very quickly. From the outset, detectives were struck by the savagery of the crime. Initially, there was speculation that this could be the work of a roaming psychopath, or perhaps a retaliatory act connected to Deirdre's well-known activism. However, crucial evidence soon steered investigators away from any theory of a political motive. A witness soon came forward with a startling story. On the previous day, they had seen a young woman hitchhiking and noticed her getting into a dark car driven by a lone man. Something about this scene prompted the witness to jot down the vehicle's registration number. This witness could never have known how vital that split-second decision would be. The police checked the registration plate and found it belonged to a Colin Campbell. Within days, officers of the Metropolitan Police knocked on the door of Colin's house. Colin answered the door, but he played ignorant to all of their questions. But investigators noticed some suspicious clues. They obtained a warrant to search his home and his vehicle, and the search yielded some damning evidence. Hidden away were items of women's clothing later identified as belonging to Deirdre, the very clothes that had been missing from the crime scene. Confronted with this evidence, Colin was placed under arrest on suspicion of murder. In custody, he soon confessed that he had indeed picked up Deirdre while she was hitchhiking, and that she had died during their encounter. Yet Colin's confession was far from straightforward. He spun a self-serving tale, claiming that what happened was an accident brought on by a medical episode. According to Colin, he made an advance towards Deirdre which she rejected, and in the ensuing altercation he suffered a epileptic fit, during which he somehow killed her. He insisted that he had not meant to harm her and that the violence was the involuntary result of his medical condition. Now, of course, seasoned detectives viewed his story with skepticism, as many would. The sheer brutality of the crime, the strangulation, the excessive beating, and the mutilation after her death did not line up with an uncontrolled seizure or any mere accident. The police found that he did have a history of epilepsy, but they also found that he had a temper and that he could become violent when he was angry. During the investigation, the police found blood in Colin's car. The blood belonged to Deirdre. The physical evidence, combined with Colin's partial admission, along with the witness testimony, gave the police a solid case. Within days, Colin was charged formally with the murder of Deirdre Sainsbury. Colin's trial commenced in July of 1985 in Reading Crown Court. It drew significant media attention due to the brutal and shocking nature of the crime. From the outset, Colin's defence conceded his responsibility for Deirdre's death, but sought to diminish his culpability. They argued that he had been provoked into a sudden, uncontrollable rage by Deirdre striking him, triggering a violent epileptic seizure. On these grounds, Colin pleaded not guilty to murder, instead offering a plea of manslaughter. The prosecution rejected his plea, insisting that he must be tried for murder. During 3 days of immense testimony, the court and Deirdre's family heard the harrowing evidence of the events from that December night. Colin then took to the stand himself, his demeanour shifting between nervous and detached as he recounted the fatal encounter in his car. He maintained that the killing occurred due to an epileptic episode that was beyond his control. Medical experts then testified about epilepsy and violence. One expert claimed that Colin did have abnormalities on his brain scans, but that there was no link between his condition and the kind of prolonged, deliberate violence inflicted on the victim. All evidence pointed to a twisted, deliberate murder. On the 26th of July 1985, Colin was found guilty of murder. However, this was just the start. For the brutal taking of Deirdre's life, Colin would serve the mandatory penalty, life imprisonment. When the sentence was handed to him, the judge continued finishing on the fact that the murder was pointless and brutal. Hearing these words and the reality of a life sentence, Colin collapsed in the dock. He fainted outright. He had to be carried out of the courtroom unconscious by security officers into the cells below. Yet, even as Colin began his life term, the truth of his crimes had not yet come to light. Colin's conviction could have easily been the end of the story, but over the following decades, the case took several unsettling turns. Colin settled into life behind bars, and Deirdre's murder faded from national headlines. But then, in the 1990s, he launched a series of appeals, citing his epilepsy and claiming diminished responsibility due to improper medication. In 1996, his murder conviction was subsequently quashed after an appeal. At a retrial in 1999, Colin pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Controversially, his plea was accepted by prosecutors. The judge acknowledged that his medical condition may have played a role, but he stressed Colin remained a significant danger. Colin was sentenced again to life imprisonment, but because of the change in crime, he became eligible for parole, having served 13 years already. Despite multiple parole hearings, officials repeatedly deemed him too dangerous to release. But by 2011, however, Colin was moved to a Category D prison and was granted monthly visits from outside. He was moving steadily towards potential freedom. The horror that Deirdre's family were facing was overwhelming. Yet, before Colin could walk free, fate and modern forensic science intervened. It turned out that an old cold case was about to set fire to Colin's chances at freedom. Deirdre was not his first kill. It turned out that in the summer of 1981, he crossed paths with a woman named Claire Wolterton. Claire was born on the 17th of August 1963, and she grew up in West London. She was known as a lively, kind girl who loved her family dearly. At 17, she was full of life and on the cusp of adulthood with hopeful plans. But this was about to be ended. Thursday, the 27th of August 1981, began like any other day for Claire. She spent the evening working at an amusement park in London. That night, she left work as usual and set off on foot towards her home in Ealing, walking along the Uxbridge Road in the gathering darkness. Sometime around 10 p.m, Claire crossed paths with her boyfriend. An argument ensued between the couple. By all accounts, it was a minor lover's quarrel, but it ended in the couple parting ways and heading home alone. It was late at night, and the streets were quiet as Claire made her solitary way along the road, a road she had walked countless times before. But this time, unbeknownst to Claire, a predator was in the vicinity. It was Colin. He forced the 17-year-old girl into his car, overpowering her despite her fierce struggle. At some point during the ordeal, Colin essayed Claire, subjecting her to unimaginable violence. He inflicted multiple stab wounds and horrific slashes, including repeated deep cuts across her throat. Claire fought back desperately, as defensive injuries clearly showed, but Colin smothered her until she lost consciousness. With Claire incapacitated and unable to resist, he drew the blade across her throat multiple times again. But then, he turned the blade to her private area, just as he did to Deirdre. This was no coincidence. He did this for his own gratification. Claire's family had no idea that anything was wrong at first. When Claire failed to come home, her mother assumed that she was staying overnight with a friend. Meanwhile, before dawn, Colin drove roughly 20 miles from Ealing to Windsor, intending to dispose of Claire's body along the River Thames. He dragged her body from his vehicle and attempted to cast her into the river from Barry Avenue. However, he was unaware of the footpath below. Claire's body landed on the footpath, exposed to passers-by, rather than hidden by the water as he intended. At sunrise, a passerby found Claire's lifeless body, setting off a chain of events that would soon unravel Colin's brutal crime. A major murder investigation was launched, spanning from West London to Windsor. The police immediately recognised that they were dealing with a highly unusual and disturbing crime. A random abduction and a sadistic murder of a teenager. The police began retracing her final movements. They spoke to her family, friends, and her boyfriend. It was soon clear that the boyfriend had no involvement. His grief and shock were genuine, and he had a solid alibi for where he was that night. Then 2 witnesses came forward. They said that they saw a man force a woman into a car. Unfortunately, in 1981, there were no CCTV cameras covering that road, and the witnesses had only caught a glimpse, so tragically, this went nowhere. Although crucially, crime scene technicians used adhesive tape to lift tiny bits of debris and fibres from Claire's skin and her hair, hoping to capture any microscopic traces left behind by the killer. At the time in 1981, DNA profiling did not yet exist, and forensic science was extremely limited to blood typing, fibres and fingerprints. Still, they preserved everything they could, not knowing that those tape lift samples would hold the key to the case decades later. As days turned into weeks, the investigation struggled to make headway. No credible suspects emerged, and the case gradually went cold. It was not until 2011 that Claire's case saw new light. Advances in forensic science and a push to revisit cold cases led to a renewed examination of the case. The lead detective who was on the case back in 1981 now led a specialist review team. They submitted the preserved evidence to modern testing. A forensic scientist applied the latest DNA profiling techniques to the decade-old samples. A full male DNA profile was successfully extracted from microscopic biological traces found on Claire's body. When this profile was run through the UK's National DNA Database, it hit a match: Colin Frederick Campbell. After 32 years of uncertainty, science had finally given Claire a name for her murderer. The man who killed Claire had been behind bars for the intervening years, yet he nearly walked free. The police gathered fresh evidence and prepared to move. In November of 2012, Colin was confronted with the new DNA findings, and he was re-arrested. When officers brought the 65-year-old man in for questioning, he had a final chance to come clean to Claire's family. Instead, Colin coldly denied knowing anything about the 1981 murder. However, the police had what they needed to bring him to justice. The trial opened in November of 2013 at Reading Crown Court, drawing on evidence both old and new. Prosecutors laid out the hauntingly similar pattern between the two murders. Epilepsy was no longer a plausible shield for Colin. In his defence, Colin now claimed amnesia and impulse coincidence. He maintained that he had zero recollection of ever meeting Claire. When he was faced with the overwhelming evidence, he grasped at a bizarre alternative story. He suggested that, perhaps long ago, he may have wandered into the amusement arcade where a teenager worked, and that she may have sat on his knee, which was his explanation as to why his DNA was found on her decades later. However, the DNA found on Claire's body was consistent with SA. This couldn't happen by just sitting on someone's knee. On the 4th of December 2013, a jury found Colin guilty of the murder of Claire. Colin stood impassively as the verdict was read. The judge noted that he had shown no remorse and had tried to get away with it for 32 years, denying Claire's family the closure they desperately needed. Colin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years, meaning he would likely never be released. The conviction of Colin for Claire's murder finally brought a measure of justice for a family that had been haunted for decades. Claire's mother in particular never recovered from the loss of her daughter, and tragically, Claire's older brother struggled his entire life with mental health issues brought on by the trauma of her murder and the case remaining unsolved. He passed away just weeks before the trial, never seeing the killer brought to justice. The judge who changed Colin's charge from murder to manslaughter back in 1999 has openly regretted his decision, stating that it should have remained a murder verdict. Today, Colin remains in prison and shows no remorse for the crimes he committed. He cares more about complaining that he's not allowed to buy his own bedding in prison, which is super sad. Thankfully, Colin will rot where he belongs for the remainder of his miserable days.